Oh, I switch my screen. Hopefully that will work. There we go. Okay. All right. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for your patience getting started. We're still working out the webcam issue, but I'd like to welcome you to part 1 of Forthright's webinar series on understanding risks in Microsoft 365. I'm Kristen from Forthright, and we are very thankful for your time today. We know you're very busy, and we appreciate you taking the time out of your day to listen to what we have to say. Hopefully it'll be useful to you. So we also, this is a 3-part series. Oh, sorry, I didn't go too fast. So the next episode of this is on license ROI and secure global administration, and it's on February 9th. And then part 3 is on information lifecycle and workspace governance, and that will be on March 9th. So I will put in the chat the link to register for part 2. And in that registration, there'll also be a link to register for part 3 if you'd like. So please go ahead and join us. And even if you can't make those dates, if you register, we'll send you the recording afterwards so you get all the information if you can't join us that exact time. So before we get started, I wanted to get some information from you all. So we're going to do a few polls, and that will also give our people time to get everything situated. So to start off, if you guys could just answer the following. Hopefully this shows up on your screen. Managing file access in SharePoint is really no different than managing it on Windows file server. So if you can answer true or false to that, then we'll kind of get an idea of what everybody thinks. Okay. All right, so I'm going to share the results of that. Looks like almost everybody thought it was false, which is correct. So the next one. Okay, why is it taking me? Oh, hide. It's a while since I've done a webinar in this, so. Okay, the next one is managing and securing data access in Teams is the same as it is in SharePoint, true or false? Okay, looks like most people have voted. And I'm going to close that and share the results. Again, looks like you guys know that that is not the case, so good. Great, and then a couple more. For backup and recovery of your 365 data, who do you rely on? Microsoft or a third-party data protection solution? Okay. And I'm going to share the results. Most of you rely on Microsoft, which is one of the reasons we're here today, so that's good. Next one. So this is, I have complete visibility of what sensitive data has been shared internally, so within your organization. Yes or no? Okay, looks like most people have voted. So almost everyone is saying no, they do not. And one more. So this is a similar question. This is, I have complete visibility of sensitive data outside, so externally, outside your organization, yes or no? Okay. And it looks like everyone has said no. And I think we have one more. It's the last one. This is how often do you audit the access to your sensitive data files? So there's a few different options. Either you don't have the ability, or you do it annually, quarterly, whenever you need to, or never. Okay, can you arrange answers here? I'm gonna go ahead and close it and share. So, okay. All right. So I'm going to hand it over to our speakers for today. We have Steve Zoberg from Forthright and Connor Dean from AvePoint. And I'll let you guys, Steve, if you want to go ahead and start by
Sure.
introducing
Good morning.
Forthright.
Good morning, everyone. Hopefully Connor is going to make it back on. Want to start by thanking all of you for joining us today for our first Spotlight session of 2023. Last year it went by pretty quick. I hope everyone had a really nice holiday with your family. And again, just wanted to thank you for joining us this morning. Hopefully Connor is going to make it on to join us. If it's your first time with us for a Spotlight series, the whole the purpose of this type of webinar is to provide us an opportunity to share our experiences out in the field, along with countless conversations that we have with our clients with you. And in the hope that we can learn from each other in the community and share this the various experiences that we have. While we know that every organization is a little different, obviously we run into very similar technology challenges, and we like to kind of open that conversation up and then work with various vendors to kind of talk about how they address that. Now, I've personally had many conversations with our clients around 365, the migration, and what ends up happening after you're on it, and obviously data protection and compliance is a really key component of that. And so we feel like you're going to find a lot of value out of this session today. It should be very informative. I'm Steve Zoberg, Chief Revenue Officer at Forthright, and again, for those of you who have joined us, but maybe you haven't worked with Forthright before, I'm going to spend a quick 1 minute just to kind of give you an intro into Forthright. We've been helping clients optimize their application delivery for decades. And for us, it's more than just tools and technology. We all have lots of options, right? It's more about how do we supercharge your end user experiences, and all while driving efficiency and added productivity gains for your business. And so we've built our practice around being user-centric in everything that we do and our thought process. Now, what that means is that our passion and our focus is not centered around what tools or products or even processes might be optimal for us, but rather we put ourselves in your shoes. We put ourselves in the shoes of the IT staff, of the various managers, and even the end users, and we pay very close attention to the experiences and the outcomes of the end user population based on the solutions that we're working with. Now, Forthright, we offer 6 core services, and each of those focus on helping you deliver consistent and exceptional user experiences. And if you're interested in finding out more about any of these, please reach out to our office, give us a ring, or send us a note with success@forthright.com, and we'd be happy to follow up with you. Now, today's conversation I find really interesting because as we're delivering these various services in different capacities, we find one thing that is very in common. We always have to be mindful of data protection in literally everything we do, and specifically data on Office 365, because it seems to be at the center of what a lot of our clients interact with. And 365 was designed to be user-centric. And over the last 5 years, we've seen this massive push toward leveraging various services that are actually integrated inside 365. And of course, by doing so, we've ran into some new and even some old challenges that aren't always apparent when businesses make the decision that we're going to move in a certain direction. Hey, Connor, great to see you. So we're going to share some of our experiences that we've had with these various issues today. We're going to discuss them with Connor. and he can share some excellent ways that we can address some of these concerns. So, Connor, thank you very much for joining us today. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about AvePoint. Oh, you're muted.
Oh, there we go. How about now? Is that working for everybody?
Perfect.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you for a little bit of patience here while I sorted myself out this morning. But no, again, AvePoint is AvePoint's been around for a couple decades now, really focused on the main mission of helping organizations collaborate with confidence. So we've looked at everything for, nowadays we're talking about things like modern workplace, right? And what that means for customers to go to M365 in some scenarios, right? What that might mean for leaving behind, legacy infrastructure or kind of that transition plan. And then once they're there, what are some of the things that they need to have in place to meet the demands of whether it's regulatory bodies or just general operations, right? So that's a lot of AvePoint's history, mainly working with, being the ability to support things like collaboration resilience, right? Looking at, digital transformation stories, and then also key stories around governance. A lot of our solutions are based completely SaaS today and helping customers attach that to their M365 or Salesforce or Dynamics experience. But again, really a long history with working with Microsoft and working with the partner community and great partners like Forthright to be able to kind of expand and bring your expertise into kind of more of that that more targeted approach to what customers are trying to accomplish in M365.
Chris, you want to go forward?
So one of the larger things is, what is that general digital transformation journey, right? What's actually happening along this path to get a customer or get myself or get my users into M365, right? And normally we've seen that kind of go through a couple iterations, right? It used to be back previously, and we can get the whole slide animated out, but it was, some normal process. We're saying, okay, what do we have on premise, right? What do we have in the cloud, or that we want to take with us to the cloud, right? We're going to get some sort of M365 licensing that's going to match the use case or the outcome that we're looking for. And it used to be things like we're going to focus on making sure we can get like Exchange or OneDrive stood up, right? And then a little bit later on, we started seeing newer workloads come to the foothold. So things like Teams or SharePoint or Yammer, when we're talking about that kind of like inner loop or outer loop collaboration for organizations. But we're kind of rushing into some of these areas, right? And administrators or regulators or leaders are kind of saying, okay, what is it that I'm stuck with navigating now, right? Because it was really simple when we were talking about that on-premise landscape. It was like, if we need more storage, we can go get another solid state or another hard drive or another NAS, right? And we can go ahead and expand that footprint and everybody can access it, right? But what are some of the potential horse blinders that we have to what we can actually see or do, right? What are some of the changes that I need to be prepared for as I look at my own organization and say, am I really kind of maturing into this correctly? Am I taking advantage of my licensing correctly? Are my users doing the right thing along the way as the workspaces move from, that in office all the time, and now it's kind of moving, especially now into this hybrid world where we have users working from a lot of different places, both internally and externally. So that's kind of what we're looking at here from that beginning, middle, and end transformation journey that, again, is kind of cyclical, right? Especially when we start talking about how we optimize some of these things.
That's really interesting. When I think about the 365 journeys that we've participated with our clients, I've noticed that, you can go to the next slide, Kristen. I've noticed that what they do is they tend to focus on the migration step. They focus on the very first step is let's get onboarded, and they miss the challenges that are going to come up on the other side of that. And when we think about these kind of projects, day two challenges are really important, and sometimes they're fundamental. Things like, how do we make sure that we're adequately protecting our data? How do we make sure that we're being compliant? And heck, once we are compliant, how do we actually validate and know that we are maintaining that compliance over the life span of this? The other thing that happens is as these new services are introduced, we find that we have sprawl that happens, right? There's new sites, there's new team sites, there's OneDrive. It's not just SharePoint, and all of a sudden you now have pockets of data that are shared in many different places, and I think it makes it difficult to manage that. And of course, when you've got to set security in so many different places, well, it introduces human error, and we see that quite a bit. Either it's incorrectly done or it's just missed altogether. And then, of course, in order to do that, many of those settings will require, especially if you're trying to do a top-down type of approach or set policies, you need global admin. And let's face it, you really want to limit how many people have global admin access. So, these are things that nobody talks about. And I think it's because they're not thinking about the fact that, listen, what we really need is solid situational awareness of who has access to my data and where it is. And when the data set gets large and the different ways of accessing the data continues to expand, these are things that they're not really planning out because they're coming from a different world, right? So you're either coming from a different cloud platform and it's handled a very different way, or you're coming from a file server, which we're seeing a lot of, and of course that's being moved up to 365, and the concepts that change are really not discussed because that focus is moving them. Kristen, if you go to the next slide. So it's clear for us, and the research shows us and all the conversation shows that, listen, 365 provides the users unprecedented power over their data. This is a huge shift from what we've had in IT, where we controlled everything, right, at the file server. And we have controls, there's no doubt, but the way that it's approached is very different. And the explosion of remote work and BYOD, data can basically be everywhere. And the concept of building walled castles and that whole approach of locking everything down behind your firewalls and your data centers, it's just not sufficient, and it doesn't really apply here. And so there's a significant shift as we move more and more into SaaS, various offerings, and obviously 365 is a huge component of all sorts of types of data that creates challenges. And I don't think what we're seeing over the last couple of years is that clients are really not thinking out how do they properly govern and how do they properly monitor their 365 environment, because the assumption is, well, I'm moving to the cloud and it's basically a cloud-based file server because that's kind of how it's sold to the business, and it's operated and protected by Microsoft. And when we look at the stats on this, the post projects, right, the outcome of these, Kristen, go to the next slide, please. What's interesting is there's a lot of different statistics. And what you'll notice is the majority of these data migration projects, well, they run over budget and they take longer than expected. Well, of course they do, because half of the people that were polled are saying, listen, wait a minute, we've got security concerns. And that's what's actually taking these projects beyond their projected timelines, because as they start doing it and they start seeing the new controls, they realize, hey, you know what? We need to rethink this. We need new policies. We need maybe even new tools to properly, address this, because it really isn't the same thing as a file server like we had before. And then you see that it's not just the governance, in the cloud, but it's also the fact that now that we have the ability of moving data around and we have all these different tools that will do that, 60% of companies, this one just, it shocks me, but it doesn't, that you have 60% of the companies that admit that, listen, we don't really properly manage the data on our ex-employees' devices. And it's because they don't have visibility to it. They don't actually know that the data is there. They don't have the proper controls to prevent it. And the typical tools they would use historically in a file server don't really work here. Different kind of setup. Next slide. So when we combine BYOD with 365, obviously you're gaining a lot of flexibility, there's a lot of capability, but remote work and BYOD also represents some significant threats that kind of need to be addressed and better understood. And I think that many businesses are looking at all of the benefits and they kind of run right into it, right? And it's clear that there is, as they adopt this, there's significant benefits that they're getting from it, but they also don't have this situational awareness that they actually need. I don't think that they really understand the risks. It seems to be clear. And fundamentally, they don't understand who actually has access to their data. They just don't have a handle on data protection and recovery, because again, they would handle this differently with file servers. And then of course, there's this assumption that Microsoft will handle it. So let's go to the next slide. So if we go back to the premise that I've heard this a lot over the last several years, and it's great to see that the polls today showed that this audience feels a little different, but the general consensus from non-technical people is, well, SharePoint works just like our file servers, right? It's just in the cloud. it's accessible anywhere, but only to our users. And while that can be true in some ways, it's really an oversimplified statement, as we all know, and especially when you consider the use of Teams and OneDrive and how that has evolved so much. All of a sudden, things are a little different. So let's take a look at this. And Connor, I'm hoping that you can help us work
Yeah.
through these challenges that we're seeing. So if we go to the next slide, we'll talk about, what did this used to look like, right? And in the past, well, we had complete control through access groups and permissions, all managed through AD. It was very simple. We could make regular backups. That was simple. High availability, we had very defined solutions for this. Auditing was easy. This is technology that's literally been around for decades. And so we understood how to do various risk assessments. HA and DR tests were easy. I mean, honestly, this was not a problem we didn't understand how to solve because, well, it's been around forever, lots and lots of solutions, and we had control of it. So now when we take a look at where we're at with the Microsoft solution, now that we've given all of this to them, well, they're going to handle it all for us, right? I mean, they do all of this. That's the general belief from the business side. And of course, what we're finding is, well, it depends. So Connor, let's kind of talk about that.
Yeah.
Let's go to the next slide. And I think this is a really interesting thing that I don't think a lot of people actually understand.
Yeah, no, I think, just to kind of start from a ground level, right? So what did we get when we went to the cloud? Because you kind of called it out before. You said, Microsoft is helping us, making sure we could take that file share and go to the cloud, right? That's really what they did. They made sure that you had a place to put your data, right? But what you're responsible for as an end customer is still your data, right? What your users have access to, what they, control, delete, right? All of those different stories, because Microsoft's, again, their service is to the actual service of OneDrive itself, to SharePoint itself, to Exchange, to make sure that those are up and running. So you don't have to have a bunch of servers actually dedicated to running that application, right? So that's what we're getting when we go to M365. And when we start there, we get a really good sense of me as an organization. When I said I wanted to go to the cloud to allow my users to be more flexible with where they work, right? What are some of the risks that I now inherit by doing that? And not necessarily in the bad way, right? Because again, now this data is available, it's potentially more enriched with more metadata, right? But I have some different vehicles where I have to make sure I have a practice for. We kind of talk about this too from, a lot of leaderships kind of understand the story too, where it's like, it's no longer CapEx for managing this, right? It's also now OpEx for managing this along in the same footing. I have to look at this in an ongoing way for what is my data actually doing inside of my environment? Who's deleting it, right? Am I protected in the case of ransomware, right? What is versioning and kind of the ceiling level there? So we see this on, on a lot more of a tactical level, right? Things like recycle bins. If a user deletes a file, how long is it available in a recycle bin, right? Or if I pull a license off of a user, how long do I have to go get that data out of their mailbox before it's gone, right? And that data is non-recoverable for me as an organization that I might need for an audit, or I might need for an ongoing project, or they documented a practice and then they're no longer there. So that's again where we say Microsoft, just to make sure it's clear, Microsoft's helping out with that service, right? You don't need to have Exchange servers on premise anymore. We've taken Active Directory to the cloud, but all those wonderful things. SharePoint's no longer this bank of SQLs that's hiding in a closet somewhere. It's a service to us, which is great, right? But we have to understand for that service, the customer responsibility is still going to be the users, the data, the permissions, who your application administrator is, right? And what their activities that they do inside of that environment. I think we can go to the next slide. And so this kind of also ties back to the story we were talking about before, because now we understand it from like a data protection perspective, right? But now let's talk about something like Teams, right? Everyone's using Teams. They're trying to make sure Teams is going well, right? What we've seen is kind of a consistent or growing story is saying, okay, I understand it from a data protection context, right? Somebody deletes something. If I'm able to get that back through a recycle bin for a limited window, I'll be okay. But like, what's my larger practice if my admin changes something? If I'm hit with a ransomware event, what's my good copy that's separate from my environment? That's one side of it. The other side of it is that we don't all work with the same kinds of data, right? What we say is like, hey, here's the company travel policy. that's generally available to all audiences. We really don't mind that, right? But if I'm working on, let's say, an SOW or a pricing contract for a customer, I might not necessarily want everybody in the company to have access to that. I definitely don't want everybody externally to have access to that, because that's not a least privilege model that works for me. But there's also a hidden layer behind that, because that's also not how people work, right? So if I'm working on something with, let's say, my manager or my boss, I'm, working on a Word document, it's inside of a Teams chat, we're going ahead and punching this up back and forth just to make sure that it's working. That data is actually stored on OneDrive, right? So that data is actually a part of a OneDrive library for those users that are actually going back and forth on Teams chat. I might take that same file and say, okay, now it's inside of a channel. We're going to hold it as a part of our library for upcoming work, right? And then now that file is in a SharePoint document library on the back end, because surprise, everything from a data perspective on the back end is SharePoint, right? And then I might even go to what's now a Teams private channel, or we see it with shared channels, right? Again, that data is now in a separate site collection, right? But if I think about the human element behind this, there's multiple copies of this likely along the way, right? I'm going to do a save as new, and I'm going to put it somewhere else, right? So as I'm developing this or working on this content with my manager, or if I'm sharing this out with external parties that are added as team members, right? There's different versions of this. And now let's change it for a second, and let's not pretend that this is the travel policy, right? Let's pretend it's the budget. Maybe it's a roadmap. Maybe it's something sensitive to us that we don't necessarily want publicly available. I have 3 different copies of this data with unique permission sets in 3 different locations, right? How am I controlling that? What's my auditing story, right? How do I answer at any given point who has access to this? So this is just one workload, not to mention when we think about Yammer, right? If I have things going through Exchange, right, and some other stories. So this is some of the things we have to be aware of when we say we want modern workplace. That's great. How do we do that with confidence? This is some of the things we have to know before we kind of go into that. And so again, I think this is a really good note too, right? Because we talked about this, and you said it almost before. We knew how to do this on premise, right? On premises was really easy. We had the firewall, right? We had the network boundary, right? As long as it was inside the perimeter, everything was fine, right? And so we had our physical security, our network defense. What we want to do is kind of take a step back here, because now that we're in M365 and Microsoft's taking care of a lot of these different endpoint controls on their application servers, right? We need to now take ownership of the part we're left with, which is looking at this not from the outside in, but more from the inside out. So we can go ahead and kick off a couple of the animations here, but it's more of saying, okay, from external users, right? If I look at just sensitive data right in the middle, right? Who has access to that inside of my environment, right? What do they have access to inside of my environment? How are we answering this question today, right? And then if I think about it again, from the inside out, the part that I'm responsible for, how is this data permeating, maybe not just with external users, but with other departments, right? How is this getting shared? Is it posted in, places that make sense? Does every team need to have PII inside of it, right? Are we taking roster calls inside of every single team that I have in my environment, or SharePoint site collection? So we could start looking at the architecture a little bit differently, but we have to kind of look at it and understand where this problem lies, right? Microsoft's helping us out with things like MFA, right? We have an endpoint, there's some data centers with some very large fences, right? So we have some good physical security. But when I need to look at what I'm responsible for, which is my sensitive data and how that's being shared, that's how we need to kind of start looking at this problem.
We see that often too, because sometimes they'll create a new location to store data and collaborate, and then all of a sudden it's not that I've protected some area and this area only certain people can see. My users now created a new area and started dropping documents, and now all of a sudden the protection or the security set for that particular area may not be sufficient. The documents all have different sensitivity levels, and what we see is our clients don't really have an efficient or an effective way of dealing with that. And if they do, they're not actually deploying the tools that they have available because they're just not aware of it. So yeah, that creates a really interesting problem that goes beyond this kind of security model.
And you said it too, right? So it's almost like the end users didn't tell IT that workspace is there, right? So
Yeah,
and then
right.
IT is going back through a behind and saying, what's this for, right? Who made this? What kind of data is this? So that's kind of what we're seeing now. That was the difference for file shares. Users could make folders, but it was very much controlled to AD permissions, right? A whole different
limited. It was also limited to internal users. And so that's the other thing that's really unique here is now all of a sudden I can add external guests And so I'm exposing data that I'm thinking is secure, and now is not, because somebody has decided to add someone externally. And listen, that's the point of the tool, right? And this is one of the collaborative benefits that we have from it. But obviously, it opens up all new concerns that when we had a file server, we never had this issue. Because the thing that you could do is you could email it, you could download it to a USB drive, but we have DLP solutions to address that. And so then the question becomes, what is the solution? How do we address this new way of causing these complications for IT?
Yep. Yeah, or just, this is where we start to acknowledge, right? This is why we need a data governance
Right.
strategy, right? Data governance, we're going to have the big magical word, right? What does this mean? This is the core of that question, right? How do we want to do things like sharing, right? Where should that be happening? How should that look? What workload is it in, right? Who do we do it with on a regular basis? That's the kind of initial. What are we protecting? What's available to us? What's our internal SLA? A lot of those stories are part of that data governance strategy.
And how do we focus on not spending all these cycles on data we don't care about? I mean, that's the other issue. Is the truth is it's a percentage. Depending on your business and your vertical, it could be 5%, it could be 80%, but there's a percentage of the data that you really care about, and then the rest is less sensitive, you don't care about. And I don't, they don't really have strategies to address that.
That's it. Then you can go to the next slide here too. And so this is kind of that, where do I sit in all of this, right? So almost kind of from the bottom up, right? If I'm looking at, me as a leader of an organization, what we've heard from our customers and saying, how can I say, what should I be focusing on? These are some really good places to kind of get started with this, right? And saying, okay, very quickly, we don't want to waste cycles on data that doesn't matter, right? My travel policy that's available to 700 users, right? We're completely fine with that. Where is all my sensitive data, right? Do we know who has access to it? Right? Is IT or the technical teams or the technical leadership aware on, how often this is reviewed, right? Do I need to have it proposed to anybody else for an audit reason later on, right? And then again, because those end users are making newer workspaces all on their own, when are they telling back to the business, right? What membership is appropriate, what external identities are required, right? And then ultimately, because again, we're still looking at the threat landscape being what it is, we have things like ransomware, we have things like Hackavision, right? Well, there's plenty of things out there that we need to be concerned about. So we got to say, okay, from a principle of kind of stealing from the zero trust story, right? What is my remediation strategy if any account gets compromised, right? If the end user that works in accounting, if they get compromised, what's my remediation strategy to getting that data back, right? Not just for getting back up and running purposes, but also to make sure that I don't lose that data, right? And so can I start looking at kind of like my threat vectors a little bit more accurately, if that makes sense?
Yeah, it's interesting because none of these typically come up when you're talking about the migration project.
Right.
It's very focused on, let's just get the data over
Right.
so we can decommission our file servers. And none of these things actually come up in that conversation, which is something that we tend to try to pause with our clients and talk about it. But obviously, at this point, many people have already made the transition, and they're just not aware, or they are aware of these challenges now, and they're trying to figure out how to address them.
Yep, that's it. All right, and I think we can open this one up here. Yep, and this is kind of that same story, right? So we have to have, okay, where do I get started in all of this, right? The way we kind of approach this is saying, okay, what kind of data do we have, right? We need to be able to answer that question. Is it PII, PCI? Is it something I have to have, called out separately because it's board reports, right? Is it my pricing list? Is it my plan for marketing next year, right? Whatever the case is that I know is going to be for restricted audiences, right? And then let's separate that from everything else, right? Our PTO policy, our leave policy, right? I need to have those available to everybody else. And then I go, okay, now I need to get a separate bucket and say, what are the external identities we're working with, right? Not just the individuals, what organizations are they? Are they contractors? Are they outsourced resources, right? What are those external identities? And what is our sharing controls for them, right? And then now I need to say, okay, with those two, which ones are falling outside of policy for us, right? What internal resources have too many external eyes on it, right? What sensitive documents have any, right? So that's kind of the process that I need to start going down outside of the general story, just making sure I have a protection strategy in place. We can go to the next slide. So again, this is kind of that story, Steve, we were talking about before, because part of that licensing is that I'm going to have protection for loss of data due to hardware failure, right? So Microsoft has things like geo redundancy and local redundancy, and making sure that they have some way of making sure that Exchange is online, right? And then your content's going to be there. So their service is going to keep what's active. What that doesn't prevent us from, facing impacts of is user error, admin error, right? Ransomware, and having a path to get forward to say, if I lose access to this data, right, can I get it back? Because that's like some of the questions we're seeing now from customers is like not even just a remediation strategy for having one, right, and just how to deal with this, but it's also coming up as, how long can I go without it for my operation?
Well, we also see a couple of other issues. We see that a lot of our clients feel that, well, I don't really need to back up this data because it's in Outlook and I can always grab a PST file. One, obviously, there's limitations with that, and if you have any kind of massive outage, that's not a very good plan of recovery. But the truth is, there's so much more data now in 365, because that's maybe where what started moving people over. But when you look at the use of SharePoint Teams, OneDrive, Planner, all the other applications that are integrated with it, there's so much data out there that is not obvious, that we're not really tracking, that people don't think about. And then on top of that, in the past, maybe we had multiple file servers and we had different backup strategies depending on which data was really important for the business, and the other stuff that, well, the user profiles, their home drives, I'm not going to worry too much about that because they have a place to put their critical data. And so maybe we don't back that up. The problem is it's all now mixed up and we don't have control of where users are moving and copying their data and how they're sharing it, because this platform is designed to give them this kind of capability to add to their productivity. And so therefore, making sure that you have visibility to all those data sets become really important. And again, what we're seeing in the field is a lot of people are, they're not aware and they're not thinking about it. Because from their perspective, I only have to worry about the version that's sitting in this one place that I know about, but I don't know about all these other pieces.
Right.
And it becomes a big issue. We've seen this happen. And I even have a client that actually had a very odd, and I've only seen this once, but they had a very odd situation with Microsoft where, in spite of having payments go through, Microsoft, and there's lawsuits involved in this, they made an error and they basically shut down the account and deleted the account, even though everything was paid. And
Right.
the customer then had a serious problem because they had no way to recover. And even Microsoft at that point, I think it took them something like 4 weeks to bring that back. And how do you
That's 4
operate
weeks
your
of
business?
downtime.
That's 4 weeks of downtime. It's still an ongoing thing, and I've never seen this happen. But these are the kind of things we have to worry about as professionals, and the people on the call. We have to worry about these, even though they probably will never happen. They might. It's our job to be stewards over all this data, and now it's much more difficult to do that now that we don't have direct control of it anymore. Yeah, carry on. Let's go to the next slide. Let's talk about how we deal with this.
Yeah. So again, how do we actually secure our data, right? And so Steve, we've seen Forthright lead a lot of these stories too and execute them really well for customers, and that's having a way to say, what's my governance policy, right? Who do we share with, and where does data go, right? Because I have to think about that a little bit more than just the file shares that I had inside of my boundary before, right? I need to be a little bit more smart and say, okay, Yammer's our outer loop, Teams is our inner loop, and we'll have some maybe SharePoint site collections that are going to be completely walled off, and maybe others, and OneDrive is our external sharing vehicle. But that decision has to be made to guide these users, right? And then we need to also be able to audit some of those follow-on things, right? But then I also have to look at the other side, right? Whether it's, Microsoft's leading my things, unfortunately, like for that one customer, but even more, just more widespread things too, where we have ransomware. Your data is going to be in there, but it's going to be encrypted unless you pay, right? You need to have a separate copy of it somewhere to be able to defend that data from, again, not just the downtime, but then the ongoing remediation from a ransomware event, right? There's almost like two costs that happen with that. So, okay, user error, ransomware, corruption, right? I need to have a way to get just the content itself, never mind the sharing and everything else, just the content itself back in and available as it was, right? So those are some of the core things of saying, how do I secure my data, or what is my data governance strategy going to kind of look like when we think about some of those self-assessment questions here?
You brought up an interesting point, because it's not just even restoring the data, it's making sure that all the permissions and
Yep,
tagging,
the permissions
and
are
all of
back.
that is also restored along with it, because otherwise you've
Mhm.
got your data back and you have a nightmare of trying to figure out how to protect it now that it's back. Excellent
Yep.
point.
Yeah, so I mean that's really it. And then having one place to do it from definitely helps, right? We don't have to already go. There's plenty of admin centers out in the world. We don't need to have too many more just to be able to kind of tackle this problem as well.
The funny thing is it's assumed that that's built in because that's what we used to have with file servers. But
Right.
it's not. Not in all solutions, and
Yep.
so it's one of those things that obviously as data management is evolving, and we're all as a community learning all these different risks. We have to address it, and some solutions address that better than others. Kristen, let's go to the next slide.
So this is it, right? So this is something that, Forthright's been a leading a partner of AvePoint's in understanding this story and making sure that it's applicable to the business cases of the clients that they work with, right? Because we see it a lot of ways, but from what we see from an M365 side, but Forthright's had a lot of expertise in working with these businesses and groups and being able to make sure they can get to the tangible outcomes that they're looking for their specific practice. So Steve, I'll let you kind of speak a little bit more to this.
Well, some of this we've talked about. I think what's really important is having the ability of having unlimited data storage. I think is a significant piece here, because we know that the more space you have, the more you use. And Microsoft, part of their value proposition is to give you a ton of storage. And our users tend to use their OneDrives for all sorts of things. Sometimes it's appropriate, sometimes it's not. And the worst thing is that if you do have some kind of cap there, not only do you have runaway cost, which is a problem, obviously for our budgets, but the last thing you want is backups not to finish, or certain pieces of data not being backed up because there's a storage scenario there. And obviously on-demand backups, which are very close to real time, is really nice. And we also like the fact that the policy enforcement mechanisms, and I don't know how deep we're going to get into it today. It's one of the reasons why we have 3 sessions here, because there's a lot to unpack in these conversations. So hopefully those of you who are with us, you'll join us for the other 2 sessions as well, because we're going to continue to get into not just the data protection, but how we deal with the governance and then the enforcement of that governance, and how the heck you manage all of this in an efficient way. And it's all going to come out in these conversations, and we'll be able to show you some of this as we get into session 2 and session 3. And then the other thing is that maybe I don't need a full restore, because maybe the issue is that the data is there, but I've made a human error, I've deleted it, I've gone in and deleted out data because I've got somebody that with malice, and I don't need to restore everything. I want to be able to pick a specific file, a folder, a Teams channel maybe. I want to be granular in my restoration, and we can do this. And a lot of this can be self-service, which is really nice. It's very easy for IT to be able to do this, with your tool set. We've had a lot of good success with that.
Yeah, no, and I think what Forthright here is kind of put around this offering, right? And understanding, let's get to a compliance state for customers. Let's, use the tools with AvePoint, right? But more importantly, being able to apply it to that business case of saying, like, this is the outcome you're looking for. If you need a data governance strategy, right? How do we actually get started there? If I need to make sure I am protected, what are some of the gaps that I might not even be aware of? Maybe just not even at M365, maybe it's something else in like an Azure footing, right? So there's plenty more to talk about there, but I think this offering here from Forthright's been, really impactful for us to even learn from, and some of the ways that your team has been able to kind of take this to customers and make sure that they get on track to having a good governance strategy for M365. Because right, it's no longer CapEx for security, right, and CapEx for my purchases. It's an OpEx and ongoing piece as well.
Yeah, I think the probably the big thing I think for us also is to help clients figure out how do we deploy conditional access, because now you have this tool that I can access anything, anywhere, and we want that because that drives a lot of productivity and capability. But we have to have controls, and we have to be able to understand who is the user actually connecting, where are they connecting from, and maybe I want to change what access you have. It's not a one size fits all, where in a file server you either had access or you didn't, or maybe you had read-only access. This has kind of changed all of that, and unfortunately for us, Microsoft's given the control to the user to determine how they're going to share it. because you can share a document and you can set whether it's read-only or view or whatever. And if we don't have policies preset and we don't have a mechanism to actually monitor and see it on how this compliance is actually working, then the users can actually undo a lot of the security that we started with. And so I think that's a key part of this whole conversation we're going to have over the next 3 series. Let's go to the next slide. So what's next, right? What do we do? And I think I brought this up a couple times. Situational awareness is key. I think understanding where you're at is a really important component, and there's different steps we can take to help you mature your current status, but it kind of comes down to what is your current state, and everybody is in a different place. And one thing that we can do with AppPoint tools is we can run some pretty phenomenal assessments. We have a special with people who have actually joining this. There's a limited amount of these complimentary quick assessments we're going to do. If we go to the next slide, the goal with these assessments is for us to show you where your risks are. And we can get very granular for these, and some of our clients have us go deep dive into the assessment, and it's kind of a different engagement. But I think it all starts with, okay, am I at risk? And if I am at risk, where? And there's a couple of different types of risks, right? Because there's the exposure risk of who and how much exposure do I have around the data that we worry about. And then the other thing is, well, what type of data? Is it sensitive data that's being exposed? The truth is that we care about all data, even if it's not sensitive, because it impacts our productivity. But then we also have compliance requirements. And so this rating system allows us to plug in the compliance requirements you have, and then run a scan on your 365 deployment and come back with these easy to read and understand reports for you, so you understand, okay, this is where our gaps are. This is where our risks are. Here's your score in the different areas. And we're looking across the entire suite, not just what's in Exchange or SharePoint. We're looking at each one of these, because the truth is you have different exposures depending on which piece of software that you're on. And then I think what this does is then open up the conversation to say, okay, what happens next? How do we help you close these gaps? Maybe you're doing great. Maybe you don't have gaps, or maybe you have gaps in just one little quick area, and therefore let's focus on that. And so the call to action today from this initial session is to hopefully we've explained some of these risks, and we've talked about obviously from a data protection perspective. So there's the obvious backup opportunity we have, and that's something that you probably right now either know or you know whether you have a gap there based on our conversation. And if you do, you should reach out and talk to us about it, and we can show you how this works and give you a demonstration of the product. If you feel you're comfortable and you've got the backup covered and you don't have that risk, but you're really not sure about what kind of exposure you might have across across your 365 environment, then grabbing one of these assessments is a very quick way of us helping you determine where you're at. And it's something that you can use for future planning later this year. And if anything, it's an audit that honestly I recommend they do on a regular basis, and we can talk about the different tools you can leverage, so that way you're aware. Because what's interesting about this is file servers, we set it, we audited it, we knew we were good. And when we did annual audits, it's because we were worried about our mistakes in IT. Maybe we would misconfigure something, we have to go back and check it. The problem here is that we don't have full control without proper governance and policies. And so if you are looking great, then we want to talk about how you continue looking great and how do you know that you continue to look great. And if you're not, then let's talk about closing those gaps, because our end users unwillingly or unwittingly, they don't know it, but they're creating compromising situations when they're sharing data or sharing entire folders or entire Teams channels, and they're not realizing the access that they're actually providing. And the worst thing is many of our clients end up having like these anonymous or shadow users, where I've had a conference call with you and I've shared something with you, and you're not in our AD, you're some random person out there, but now all of a sudden you continue to have access. So many of our clients will say, well, that's okay, and it is, but how about putting some kind of expiration on it? How about saying, I'm going to give you access for 30 days or 60 days, or maybe I'm going to give you access to view it, but I'm not going to let you download anything. These are things that have to be set, and the governance policy is key to document that first so users know it. But the truth is, it's not enough, right? We need to have the enforcement tools in place. So if we've got the policy defined on paper, and then we have a tool that basically replicates those policies and takes in consideration the various compliance requirements you have, it enforces it. So when the user goes and does something, it doesn't matter because the system's going to say, okay, that's great. You want to share that data. That's marked sensitive, so I'm not going to let you, or I'm going to let you under very specific guidelines because the policy's been set, and I'm literally going to override what you just did because I'm watching. And having a tool like that is really important. And out of the box with Microsoft, you're very limited on what you can do. And then I would tell you the other thing is Microsoft does have great tools. So I don't want to talk that down, but their manual is 3,000 pages for a reason. This is a very complex problem that we've created. And you could do it that way, or you can use advanced tools and make your job so much easier. And again, avoid the human error, because I think when you have things that are too complex for us to deploy and maintain, even if we get it right day one, maintaining that makes it so much more difficult. There is a reason why third-party tools exist. And just like Microsoft says, listen, I'm going to take care of your data because I'm responsible for it because I'm delivering a service, but only under certain circumstances. These other areas, we want you to go work with a third party, and they even have that in their, their EULA, but people just don't read it. So I think you should ask yourself these questions, and depending on where you feel you fit, definitely reach out if any of this is of interest. And of course, our next sessions, we're going to talk about governance. We're going to talk about license management. That's a big thing too, because a lot of people are rolling this out and we're paying for licensing and we're not using it. And so there is a lot of budget that can be protected by understanding which users should have which license types and who's actually using it and so on. And so that's one of our future conversations. And then of course, we'll be able to show you some of these tools on how you can actually control the governance and the enforcement of these platforms and what that looks like. I'll give you a little hint to it. I'm sure everybody in this call understands what group policies and how group policies work in Active Directory, because if you've been in IT for any period of time, I mean, it's been around right for decades. It's kind of like that. It's an engine that is so simple to use, but even far more intuitive, because you can plug in the type of compliance that you need for your business, and you don't have to create your custom policies. You can, but you don't need to. The system is smart enough to say, oh, I need this. We're PCI. Okay, great. I'm going to apply that. And now I'm going to push that down to your organization, and I'm going to constantly monitor it for you. So we're going to be talking about those in the future. But I think it's a good place to start to understand where you're at. Hopefully we've kind of scratched the surface on some things that you should be looking at, that we're having these conversations with so many clients that are realizing, you know what, we kind of thought we had a handle on it. Maybe we don't. And this assessment gives you the data point to be confident as to where you're at, and whether it's something significant that you need to do, or optimization, or just maintaining the good work that you've done. Having that understanding is key, and this doesn't exist out of the box with Microsoft. There's not some great report that I can run that's going to give me this kind of visibility. Appreciate everybody's time. Connor, I don't know if there's anything that we needed to add to this.
No, thank you. This is one of many, right? We're looking forward to having the ongoing conversation, right? Kind of thinking back to that timeline, right? If we thought about just getting the cloud, or we're thinking about going soon, what are some of the things I should be looking at early days before I go into that next step?
Right. Thank you, everyone, for joining. We look forward to seeing you next month, and hopefully we will speak to some of you between now and then. Reach out. You'll get a follow-up email from this as well, and you can respond or send us an email at success@forthright.com. We'd love to hear from you. Have a great Thursday.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.